In the early 1920s, Los Angeles was a rapidly growing city where new suburban neighborhoods spread out around Hollywood and downtown, and families from across North America and Europe arrived seeking opportunity. In this unsettled urban landscape, Alsa Thompson, a 7-year-old Canadian-born girl, would unexpectedly become the central figure in a poisoning case that deeply disturbed both the public and the legal authorities. American society at that time held a strongly idealized view of childhood. Children were generally seen as innocent, morally impressionable beings in need of protection, rather than as potential perpetrators of serious crime. The criminal law of California reflected this assumption. Under the prevailing legal standards, a child under the age of 8 was considered incapable of forming the necessary criminal intent to be held fully responsible in a court of law, no matter how grave the alleged act. At the same time, the press in Los Angeles and other major cities was becoming increasingly powerful in shaping public reactions to crime. Cases involving domestic settings, family conflict, or unnatural behavior by women and children attracted particular attention. A very young girl connected to multiple deaths by poisoning and described as calm and articulate in her statements, challenged the public's moral and emotional expectations. Within this wider context of legal limits, media sensationalism, and fragile family structures, the figure of Alsa Thompson emerged not just as a child suspect, but as a symbol of troubling questions about juvenile violence and the capacity of the legal system to respond. Alsa Thompson was born on the 23rd of April 1917 in Dauphin, Manitoba, Canada, into what, on the surface, appeared to be an ordinary family of modest means. Her early years were spent in a domestic environment that, like many households of the period, was structured around clear parental authority, religiously influenced moral expectations, and a relatively strict approach to discipline. There is no detailed record of her schooling or early education, but it is evident that by the age of 7, she was capable of giving coherent, detailed statements to adults, suggesting at least average intellectual development for her age. The stability of Alsa's childhood was severely disrupted in 1924 when her parents separated and her mother subsequently formed a new relationship. This family breakdown, occurring when the child was about 7 years old, appears in contemporary reports and later commentary as a key psychological stressor. The separation led to a change of country and environment. Alsa was brought to Los Angeles, joining the substantial migrant population that was then reshaping Southern California's urban and social landscape. In Los Angeles, Alsa did not remain continuously in a single parental home. Instead, by December 1924, she was living in the household of the Platt family, with whom she boarded. The precise financial and domestic arrangements are not fully recorded, but she effectively occupied the position of a child guest or semi-dependent in a home that was not her own. This status likely created a complex mix of expectations, affection, and discipline, especially for a child already affected by family separation and relocation. Contemporary accounts also refer to earlier deaths within her immediate family. Twin sisters, Mildred and Muriel, who died around 1921. These deaths later became central to Alsa's own statements to the police. Whether or not they were recognized at the time as suspicious, they represent further loss and instability within her early life. By the beginning of 1925, Alsa stood at a critical turning point. A young foreign-born child, recently uprooted, living with non-relatives and already associated, at least in her own retrospective narrative, with multiple family tragedies. It is from this fragile position that the events described in the next section would unfold. The chain of events that brought Alsa Thompson to public and legal attention began in late 1924 and early 1925 in Los Angeles, within the household of the Platt family. Alsa had been living with the Platts since approximately December 1924. In January 1925, members of the Platt household fell suddenly and violently ill after consuming ordinary meals and drinks prepared or handled within the home. According to later reports, coffee and a dish of roast lamb were among the items served shortly before the onset of symptoms. The illnesses were characterized by severe gastric distress and vomiting, and they affected multiple members of the family. Alsa herself, however, did not become ill. This discrepancy, combined with the recurrent and unexplained nature of the sickness, gradually raised suspicion within the household. The Platts began to fear that some foreign substance had been introduced into their food or drink. Suspicion ultimately fell upon the child living under their roof, not because of any single explicit act witnessed by adults, but because of circumstantial factors. Her access to the kitchen and pantry, her apparent lack of symptoms, and her sometimes troubling behavior. As concern escalated, the matter was brought to the attention of the Los Angeles police. On the 4th of February 1925, Alsa was questioned by officers in connection with the suspected poisoning attempts on the Platt family. During this interview, she reportedly remained calm and responsive. It was in this context that she made a series of statements that would change the character of the investigation entirely. According to contemporary press accounts and surviving summaries, Alsa admitted to having taken acid from a radio battery and mixing it into the Platt's coffee and food. More strikingly, she went on to describe earlier acts, placing ground glass into the food of her infant twin sisters some years earlier, and adding ant paste to food consumed by a former caregiver, Nettie Stell, in 1924. These admissions, given by a 7-year-old child in a matter-of-fact tone, transformed what had initially appeared to be a domestic health mystery into a potential history of serial poisoning. Families, neighbors, and law enforcement moved from bewilderment to alarm, and formal inquiries into the truth of Alsa's narrative began. Once Alsa Thompson began to speak to police on the 4th of February 1925, the focus of the authorities shifted rapidly from the Platt household incident to a wider inquiry into her past. The initial step was to verify, as far as possible, the details she provided regarding the attempted poisoning of the Platts. Officers examined the Platt residence, including the kitchen and the radio set from which, according to her statement, she had obtained acid. Reports from the time indicate that investigators did find a battery or similar device whose contents could, in principle, produce a corrosive solution capable of causing serious gastric distress if ingested. The family's accounts of sudden illness after drinking coffee or eating lamb, contrasted with the fact that Alsa alone remained well, were taken as supporting circumstances rather than direct proof. No chemical analysis from that period is recorded in modern summaries in a way that would meet contemporary forensic standards. Instead, the authorities relied heavily on the convergence of her confession, the symptoms described, and her opportunity to introduce the substance into the food. From there, detectives turned to the more serious allegations contained in her narrative, the deaths of her twin sisters several years earlier, and the death of her former caregiver, Nettie Stell, in 1924. Investigators sought out prior medical and death records, as well as relatives and neighbors who could recall the circumstances of those deaths. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe efforts to review earlier post-mortem findings and, in at least one instance, to consider exhumation or re-examination of remains in light of the new information. With respect to the twins, Alsa's story was that at about 4 years of age, she had ground glass from a kitchen container and placed it in their food because their crying distressed her. She stated that they subsequently became ill and died, and that she experienced a mixture of regret and relief. Medical professionals consulted by the police considered whether injuries observed at the time of death could be reconciled with such a mechanism. Some commentary suggested that the original diagnoses of the twins' deaths were not inconsistent with ingestion of a harmful substance, though the surviving record does not present a definitive forensic conclusion. In the case of Nettie Stell, Alsa claimed to have used ant paste, a commercially available insect poison, to contaminate food after the woman scolded her. Investigators looked into Stell's final illness, which had been characterized by severe gastrointestinal symptoms. The fact that ant poisons of the era could contain toxic ingredients gave a measure of plausibility to Alsa's account, and the temporal relationship between Alsa's presence in the household and Stell's fatal illness was noted. However, again, the documentary record available today does not show a formal finding of homicide based solely on toxicological proof. Parallel to these fact-finding efforts, the Los Angeles authorities engaged psychiatric experts to examine the child. Dr. Paul Bowers and other specialists interviewed Alsa, attempting to assess both her mental state and the reliability of her statements. They noted features suggestive of psychological disturbance, such as apparent emotional detachment when describing harm, a history of cruelty to animals, and family instability following her parents' separation. Yet they did not classify her as legally insane in the narrow sense then required to negate responsibility. A central difficulty for investigators was the dual nature of her disclosures. On one hand, many details she gave, including addresses, names, and specific methods, could be independently corroborated as at least possible, and sometimes as accurate. On the other hand, some elements appeared embellished or inconsistent, raising the concern that her narrative might be a mixture of truth, fantasy, and a child's attempt to respond to adult questioning. By the close of the investigative phase, the authorities had reached a working position that there was substantial reason to believe Alsa had deliberately introduced harmful substances into food on multiple occasions, resulting in at least one death and several serious illnesses, but that the available evidence, especially regarding the earlier fatalities, fell short of the clear, technical proof typically demanded in adult murder prosecutions. This uncertainty, combined with her age and psychiatric profile, would strongly shape what followed in the legal arena. When the investigative phase reached its natural limit, the authorities in Los Angeles faced an unprecedented legal problem. What to do with a 7-year-old child who had apparently confessed to actions that, in an adult, would constitute multiple counts of homicide by poisoning? Under California law at the time, children under the age of 8 were presumed incapable of committing a crime in the full legal sense. This statutory presumption meant that a conventional criminal indictment for murder or attempted murder was effectively barred. Instead of a full jury trial in a criminal court, the case was addressed through a combination of in-camera hearings, psychiatric evaluations, and consultations between prosecutors, judges, and child welfare authorities. Contemporary press coverage refers to sessions in which Alsa was questioned in the presence of officials and medical experts rather than before a public jury. These proceedings, while legal in character, were focused less on proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and more on determining her mental condition and the appropriate custodial or therapeutic response. The prosecution's theory of the case, insofar as it can be reconstructed from surviving reports, rested on 3 pillars. First, that Alsa's statements about poisoning attempts were, in their core elements, truthful. Second, that her actions had directly caused at least one death and had endangered others. And third, that her pattern of behavior, deliberate administration of harmful substances, cruelty to animals, and targeted retaliation against those who scolded her, demonstrated a level of intent incompatible with mere childish mischief. Officials emphasized the consistency of certain details across her accounts, and the corroborating circumstances surrounding the Platt family's illness and the deaths of her sisters and caretaker. On the other side, there was no formal defense in the adversarial courtroom sense, but doctors and some officials raised mitigating considerations. Psychiatric experts described her as mentally disturbed and emotionally damaged by family turmoil, yet not so deranged as to meet the narrow legal threshold of insanity typically applied to adults. They also warned that a young child exposed to intense questioning and sensational press attention might exaggerate or distort events. Moreover, the absence of definitive forensic proof for the earlier deaths complicated any attempt to frame her actions within traditional categories of criminal liability. The judge or judges involved, therefore, did not deliver a verdict of guilty or not guilty on specific counts. Instead, the legal disposition, again reconstructed from secondary sources, was that Alsa should not be prosecuted as a criminal, but should be removed from ordinary family life and placed under medical and institutional supervision. She was formally classified as suffering from a form of mental weakness or disturbance, and arrangements were made for her to be held in a facility where her behavior could be monitored and treated. Thus, the case concluded not with a death sentence or term of imprisonment, but with a protective and custodial order. In legal terms, Alsa Thompson remained a child beyond the reach of direct criminal punishment, yet her own statements and the surrounding circumstances ensured that she would not simply be returned to ordinary society without restriction. In the months and years following the 1925 hearing, the Alsa Thompson case continued to be cited by legal and medical circles as an extreme illustration of the difficulties faced by very young offenders. Newspapers frequently reprinted the story, often under headlines that emphasized her youth and the number of alleged victims, and commentators debated whether she should be viewed primarily as a perpetrator or as a child deeply traumatized by family breakdown and instability. A major controversy concerned the reliability of her confession. Some doctors and observers suggested that a child could have described her actions with chilling accuracy, and the confirmed poisoning of the Platt family, along with her cruelty to animals, corroborated her accounts of previous incidents. Others have highlighted the inaccuracy of child testimony, the risk of suggestion during repeated interrogations, and the lack of comprehensive forensic examinations at the time of the previous deaths. Another persistent problem is structural. The case has exposed a gap in the legal system between child welfare and adult criminal justice systems. Lawmakers and legal commentators have cited Alsa's story as an example of how laws prohibiting the prosecution of very young children can lead authorities to arbitrarily impose custodial and medical measures without clear procedural safeguards or long-term planning. The available literature does not specifically record Alsa Thompson's later life, her place of residence, or her date of death, leaving the end of her life in the murky waters of history rather than in the official legal record. The case of Alsa Thompson brings together several fault lines of early 20th century justice: a succession of unexplained or suspicious deaths, a detailed confession from a 7-year-old child, and a legal system that classified her as incapable of crime, yet clearly dangerous. Her own reported description of feeling glad it was quiet after her sister's deaths, followed by apparent remorse, captures the disturbing mixture of emotional disturbance and limited understanding that perplexed doctors and officials alike. With what we know today about child psychology and trauma, how should such a case be approached? As a matter of crime, of mental health, or both? Do you consider the decision not to prosecute, but to confine and treat Alsa an adequate form of justice for the victims and their families, or an illustration of how unprepared the system was for a child who admitted to lethal violence?